A lone merchant guides his camel along a narrow cliff edge, one misstep from a 1,000-foot drop. This was the daily reality on the medieval world's greatest superhighways. We are exploring 25 historic trade routes that did far more than move silk and spices. They carried religions, technologies, and devastating plagues, weaving together the very fabric of the medieval world. By the end, you will grasp how these forgotten paths secretly built our modern globe. We will uncover why kings hid the source of their gold and how entire cities vanished when their route was abandoned. What single object from your home do you think could launch a journey across continents? That narrow cliff path was but one thread in a web of connections spanning continents, a network we call the Silk Road. Far more than a single road, this was the ultimate medieval superhighway, a sprawling labyrinth of land and sea paths linking the silken courts of China to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. For over 1,000 years, this was the planet's main artery, and what flowed through it changed humanity forever. The most famous cargo was, of course, silk, a fabric so precious it was literally worth its weight in gold. But caravans carried far more than just clothes. They bore pungent spices that could preserve food and mask the taste of age, delicate porcelain that sang with a ring when tapped, and glittering precious stones that adorned the crowns of kings and emperors. Yet the most transformative goods were not physical objects at all. They were ideas. Technologies like paper-making and gunpowder traveled west from China, altering warfare and record-keeping forever. Religions moved with the merchants as Buddhist monks carried their teachings from India into East Asia, and the message of Islam spread peacefully along these commercial tracks. But the road was a two-way street, and it carried darkness as well as light. The same caravans that brought wealth and knowledge also carried the fleas that hosted the Black Death, a pandemic that would eventually wipe out a staggering portion of Europe's population. Who were the people brave enough to traverse such a vast and perilous world? They were mysterious figures like Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant whose incredible and sometimes doubted tales of the East opened Europe's eyes to the wonders of Cathay. Their journeys were not through empty space, but between legendary cities that blossomed in the desert like mirages made real. Oases of power and culture like Samarkand, with its turquoise-tiled mosques, became cosmic crossroads where languages, customs, and goods from across the known world were bartered and blended. What forgotten secrets still lie buried beneath the sands of those once great cities, waiting to be uncovered? While the Silk Road connected the great empires of the East, another legendary path pulsed with life far to the north. This was the Amber Road, a river of fossilized sunlight flowing from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea to the warm heart of the Mediterranean. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, the source of this golden, translucent stone was a profound mystery. They knew it washed up on distant northern beaches, but the exact lands were the stuff of legend, a secret fiercely guarded by the peoples who lived there. This northern gold was not mined from the earth but harvested from the sea, a gift from the waves that captivated the classical world. Its value was immense, with a single, finely carved amber figurine sometimes trading for the price of a healthy young slave. The allure was not just its beauty. When rubbed against cloth, amber develops a magnetic charge, attracting dust and feathers, a magical property that seemed to prove it held the very essence of life. How did this mysterious substance travel thousands of miles from its obscure source to the hands of Mediterranean nobility? The route was a winding network of rivers and overland tracks, a treacherous journey from the Baltic coast, through the dense forests of modern Poland and the Czech Republic, over the mighty Alps, and finally down into the trading hubs of northern Italy and the glittering courts of Greece. This was not a road for the faint of heart, but for specialized merchants who formed powerful guilds to control every step of the process. They established fortified trading posts at key river crossings, creating a chain of commerce that moved this precious cargo southward. We know this trade was thriving even in the Bronze Age because of stunning archaeological finds. In the royal tombs of Mycenae, the same city of the legendary King Agamemnon, archaeologists have uncovered beads of perfectly preserved Baltic amber, placed as grave goods for the elite over 3,000 years ago. That amber had traveled the entire length of the European continent, a silent witness to a trade network that was already ancient when Homer composed his epic poems. The guilds that managed this trade grew immensely wealthy and powerful, becoming the shadowy cartels of their day. They knew that their power depended on maintaining the mystery, on being the only link between a distant, mythical north and the civilized south that craved its most beautiful treasure. What other luxuries, lost to history, traveled these same shadowy paths into the ancient world? While Northern Europe traded in fossilized sunlight, an even more demanding route forged a river of gold across the world's greatest sea of sand. The Sahara Desert was not a barren wasteland to be avoided, but a monumental ocean to be crossed, and the caravans that braved its depths were the largest the world had ever seen. These were the Trans-Saharan trade routes, a network of trails connecting the powerful West African empires to the Mediterranean world. The entire system was built on a simple, powerful exchange. The south had gold in unimaginable quantities, and the north possessed the Sahara's most vital treasure, salt. In the scorching heat, salt was not just a seasoning, it was a matter of life and death, essential for preserving food and replacing nutrients lost to constant sweat. So vital was this mineral that, pound for pound, it was often traded directly for gold in a silent, staggering exchange deep in the desert. This impossible trade was made possible by one creature, the camel. These animals were the desert's great ships, capable of carrying heavy loads for weeks with minimal water, but even the hardiest camel needed a navigator. The masters of this sandy ocean were the Tuareg people, the legendary blue-veiled guides who could read the stars and the shifting dunes as if they were a map. They led caravans of thousands of camels, a moving city of leather and cloth, on journeys that could last for months. A single caravan's safe passage was a monumental achievement, a testament to human endurance and specialized knowledge. The kings of West African empires like Ghana, Mali, and Song grew immensely wealthy from this trade, and they protected their source with a secrecy that would make the Amber Guild seem open. The origin of their gold was a state secret of the highest order. Miners in the Wangara region worked in isolated communities, and trade was conducted through a system of silent barter. North African merchants would arrive at a designated riverbank, lay out their goods and slabs of salt, then retreat. The local gold traders would then approach, leave a pile of gold they deemed fair, and also withdraw. The merchants would return, and if they were satisfied, they would take the gold and leave. If not, they would wait until more gold was added. This way, the two groups never met face to face, and the specific location of the gold fields remained a mystery protected for centuries. All this wealth and knowledge flowed into legendary cities that rose from the desert's edge. The most famous was Timbuktu. It began as a simple Tuareg campsite but exploded into a metropolis of trade and scholarship. At its peak, Timbuktu was not just a market for gold and salt. It was a beacon of learning, home to the legendary Sankore University and libraries filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its reputation for wealth became so immense in Europe that it turned into a mythical, almost unreachable symbol of affluence. Yet this city of scholars and merchants owed its entire existence to the caravans that snaked across the dunes, carrying the two commodities that built empires, gold from the south and salt from the north. What incredible works of art and literature were produced in these desert metropolises, funded entirely by the value of a seasoning and a shiny metal. The deserts of Africa were not the only places where fortunes were made from the simple contents of a kitchen cupboard. Far to the east, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, lay a maritime world where the air itself was a commodity. The spice routes were not mere paths across the water, they were highways of aroma connecting the bustling ports of Europe to the mist-shrouded islands of Southeast Asia. The spices they carried were not just for flavor, they were a form of currency. A sack of peppercorns could pay a year's rent, and a single nutmeg was worth more than a farmer's horse. This was a trade born from a powerful paradox. Europe craved these exotic flavors, but for centuries it had absolutely no idea where they actually came from. The source was a secret jealously guarded by a chain of middlemen. Arab merchants, masters of the monsoon winds, would sail their dhows from the spice ports of India across the Arabian Sea. They brought their precious cargo to the eastern Mediterranean, where Venetian traders waited. The Venetians then became the sole distributors to a spice-starved Europe, marking up the price at every step and building their entire floating city on a foundation of pepper and cloves. The journey for the spices themselves was almost unimaginably long. A merchant in Venice selling a jar of cinnamon was holding a product that had traveled from the forests of Sri Lanka, a voyage of over 10,000 miles by land and sea. Sailors on these routes faced horrors beyond the simple storms and pirates. They sailed off the edge of their known world, into oceans rumored to be boiling at the equator and populated by monsters. Medieval maps depicted these distant waters filled with sea serpents large enough to crush a ship, and mermaids whose songs led sailors to their doom. The fear was so palpable that for generations, European ships refused to sail south along the African coast, terrified of a point of no return. This profound mystery, combined with the staggering cost of spices, created an obsession that would shatter the old world order. Why pay a fortune to the Venetians and the Arabs if you could go directly to the source? This single, powerful question is what launched the age of exploration. It was the desire to break the spice monopoly that sent Portuguese caravels creeping down the African coast and eventually convinced a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus to sail west into the utter unknown, believing he could reach the spice-rich Indies by a new route. He stumbled upon a new world instead, all because of the relentless European hunger for a flavor that could make spoiled meat palatable and a drink taste of paradise. What other world-changing discoveries were made entirely by accident, all in the desperate pursuit of a few fragrant tree barks and dried flower buds? While the spice routes crossed oceans, another path carried its fortune on the wind, a scent so divine it built cities from stone and funded kingdoms from incense alone. This was the incense route, a ribbon of trails weaving through the brutal deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. For over 1,000 years, camel caravans bore precious cargoes of frankincense and myrrh from the remote valleys of southern Arabia, in what is now Oman and Yemen, northward to the temples and palaces of Egypt, Rome, and Jerusalem. The journey was a trial by fire. Caravans faced scorching days, freezing nights, and endless dunes, all while navigating by stars and subtle landmarks known only to the Bedouin guide. These masters of the desert could find a single water hole in 1,000 square miles of barren rock, their survival knowledge as valuable as the fragrant resin they protected. So what made these hardened tree saps worth such a perilous journey? Frankincense and myrrh were not mere perfumes, they were the breath of the divine. In a world without modern sanitation, their rich, cleansing smoke was believed to carry prayers directly to the gods, purifying the air in temples and during sacred rites. Myrrh, with its earthy, medicinal scent, was a key ingredient in holy anointing oils and was used in embalming, making it essential for both the beginning of spiritual life and the end of physical life. Their value was staggering, at times rivaling gold itself. The secret to this immense wealth lay in the trees, and their location was a state secret more protected than any treasure map. The scraggy boswellia and commiphora trees, which weep the precious frankincense and myrrh resin when cut, grew only in this specific region. Southern Arabians became masters of misinformation, telling wild tales to foreign merchants about the resins being guarded by winged serpents or harvested from mythical gardens to obscure the true source. This control over the supply allowed a desert power to rise from the sands, the Nabateans. You might know them for their breathtaking capital, the rock-carved city of Petra. Its magnificent tombs and temples were not funded by conquest but by commerce. The Nabateans built a network of wells and fortresses along the incense route, acting as the indispensable middlemen. They provided water, security, and marked up prices, siphoning a portion of the wealth from every caravan that passed through their territory. Petra itself was a brilliant nexus, a desert port where goods from Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean were exchanged, all because the Nabateans understood that controlling the path of a sacred scent was more powerful than controlling an army. So the next time you catch the scent of incense, consider that for centuries the fate of empires hinged on the value of tree sap and the silent, secretive journeys of camels carrying the very smell of heaven across a burning hell. Far from the deserts of Arabia, fortune flowed along rivers of a different kind, cold, powerful waterways that carved through the endless forests of the north. These were the Varangian routes, the superhighways of the Vikings. When these Scandinavian warriors and traders turned their longships east, they became known to the locals as the Varangians, and their journeys would reshape the map of a continent. Their path was not across open sea, but a daring riverine gauntlet. They launched their sleek vessels from the Baltic, rowing up the mighty Volkhov and Dnieper rivers. The journey was brutal, requiring them to drag their ships overland between waterways, a backbreaking process called portage, all while navigating territories of often hostile Slavic and Turkic tribes. So what drove them to attempt such an arduous passage? The answer lay at the journey's end, in a city of almost mythical wealth, Constantinople. The goods they carried from the north were the treasures of the wild. Thick furs from sable, fox, and beaver were worth a fortune in the Mediterranean climate, where such luxury was unknown. They brought honey and wax from the vast forests, essential for candles and sweetness, and the ever-present amber from their own Baltic shores. And tragically, they also traded in human captives, a dark and profitable commodity along these routes. In return, they sought the refined riches of the Byzantine Empire. They bargained for shimmering silks that felt like water in the hand, for fine wines and jewelry, and most of all for silver. The Byzantine silver coin, the Miliresian, was so coveted that hordes of them are still dug up all across Scandinavia today, the direct payment for northern goods. But this was more than a simple trade network. It was the very foundation of a nation. The Varangians did not just pass through the land of the Slavs, they settled there. To protect their lucrative trade routes, they established fortified settlements at key points along the rivers. One of these, a small town on the Dnieper called Kiev, would grow into the powerhouse of a new state, Kievan Rus. This was the genesis of Russia itself, a kingdom born from the marriage of Scandinavian ambition and Slavic land. Nothing, however, could have prepared a Viking for their first sight of Constantinople. After months of rough travel through dark forests, they would emerge onto the Black Sea and sail toward the Theodosian walls. These were not mere city walls, they were a monumental fortification over 5 miles long and 40 feet high, a sheer stone curtain that must have seemed like the edge of the world. Beyond them lay a city of 1 million souls, with streets paved in marble, domed churches glittering with gold mosaic, and a palace that held a mechanical tree with singing bronze birds. For a warrior from a land of wood and turf, the sheer scale, wealth, and technology of this place would have been utterly shattering to the senses. It was a confrontation between two worlds, one of northern frost and one of southern splendor, and it left an indelible mark on both. The Varangians were so impressed that many stayed, forming the elite Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor himself. These fierce warriors, sworn to the service of a distant Christian emperor, became a symbol of how far a Norseman would travel and what he would become, all for a chance to touch the grandeur at the end of the river road. While the Varangians navigated wild rivers to reach foreign splendor, an even more astonishing waterway was being carved through the very heart of a civilization. The Grand Canal of China was not a path to a distant city. It was a city in motion, an imperial masterpiece of logistics that turned the country itself into a single, functioning organism. Its story begins over 1400 years ago during the short but ambitious Sui dynasty. The emperor had a profound problem. China's fertile, rice-rich south was a world away from the political and military power centered in the arid north. How could an emperor feed his massive capital and the armies guarding the frontier without a reliable supply line? The answer was to build a river. The Sui emperors launched a project of staggering scale, connecting the Yellow River in the north to the mighty Yangtze River in the south. This was not a gentle canal, it was a manufactured waterway hundreds of miles long, crossing varied and difficult terrain. But the Sui vision was just the beginning. It was during the glorious Tang dynasty that the Grand Canal truly became the empire's lifeline. The engineering challenges were almost beyond comprehension. How do you make water flow steadily across flat plains and over hills? Chinese engineers became masters of hydraulic science, designing sophisticated lock gates to manage water levels and channeling entire rivers to feed the canal. They built the longest artificial waterway the world had ever seen, a liquid highway stretching over 1,100 miles. Its primary cargo was the lifeblood of the state, grain. Every year, a massive government-run fleet of barges, known as the Grain Transport Fleet, would sail north from the Yangtze Delta. They carried millions of tons of rice to feed the bustling capital of Chang'an, a city of over 1 million people, and the soldiers stationed along the Great Wall. Without this constant flow of food, the northern heart of the empire would simply starve. But the barges carried more than just sustenance. They brought delicate southern silks for the imperial court, tea, porcelain, and luxury goods that fueled a unified national economy. For the first time, a peasant in the north could eat rice grown in the south, and a merchant in the south could sell his wares in northern markets, all thanks to this single man-made river. The true mystery of the Grand Canal lies not in the stone and water, but in the human effort it demanded. The logistics of maintaining this system were a perpetual, silent war against nature. Silt from the Yellow River constantly choked the channel, requiring an army of laborers to dredge it by hand, season after season. The organization needed to coordinate this labor, to build and repair the locks, and to manage the thousands of boats on the water was a bureaucratic marvel that rivaled the engineering. This was an empire run on paperwork and planning, all to keep the grain flowing north and the emperor's authority flowing south. It was the internet of its age, a network of information, goods, and power that bound the nation together, proving that sometimes the greatest journeys are not out into the unknown, but the continuous, vital flow that keeps a civilization alive. What other invisible systems, humming quietly in the background, hold our own modern world together? A merchant republic without a king or a flag, the Hanseatic League was a network of cities that became the undisputed master of northern Europe's seas. From the 13th to the 17th centuries, this coalition of merchant guilds and towns, with Lübeck as its capital, wove a commercial web across the Baltic and North Seas. Their outposts stretched from Novgorod in the east, a fortified contour where German merchants lived in isolated privilege, to the bustling cloth markets of Bruges in the west. This was not an empire of land, but an empire of trade, and its currency was the humble bounty of the north. Vast schools of Baltic herring, salted and barreled, formed a mobile protein source that fed millions. Mighty timbers from Scandinavia's endless forests built the ships and cities of a growing Europe. Furs from Russia kept the wealthy warm, while beeswax from the same lands provided the clean, burning candles essential for both churches and households. Rivers of grain from the plains of Poland flowed westward, but how did a loose alliance of merchants command such power? They understood that unity was their greatest weapon. The League could impose devastating trade embargoes, blockading entire kingdoms until their demands were met. They maintained their own armies and navies to protect their convoys from pirates, and they negotiated treaties as a single formidable entity. Their foreign trading posts, the contours, were like independent city-states within a city, operating under Hanseatic law and sealed off from local interference. The mystery that surrounded them was as thick as a Baltic fog. Their trade practices were secretive, their ledgers closed, and their meetings private. They perfected a system of silent partnership and coded communication to protect their commercial advantages, creating a monopoly that felt almost impenetrable to outsiders. What knowledge was so valuable that it had to be guarded behind the high walls of the contour, known only to the initiated few? High in the cloud-wrapped mountains of southwestern China, a different kind of exchange pulsed along narrow, treacherous trails. This was the tea and horse road, a high-altitude artery where empires traded their defining strengths. For centuries, Chinese tea moved west into the high plateau of Tibet, and in return, the powerful warhorses bred on those windswept plains traveled east. This was not a luxury trade, it was a strategic necessity. The Chinese military, constantly defending its vast frontiers, was desperate for the sturdy, agile Tibetan horses, animals bred for survival in thin air and rugged terrain. Tibet, with its high-altitude diet based on barley and dairy, had an equally profound need for the tea. The caffeine and nutrients in compressed tea bricks were essential for combating the effects of a diet heavy in meat and dairy, making tea a dietary staple as vital as grain itself. The caravans that managed this impossible exchange were feats of human endurance. Mule trains, not camels, were the beasts of burden here, their drivers navigating paths that clung to the sides of sheer cliffs, crossing flimsy rope bridges over roaring gorges thousands of feet deep. A single misstep meant a plummet into oblivion, and the thin, cold air at those altitudes was a constant, draining adversary. These caravan drivers developed a unique, rugged culture of their own, bound by superstition and an intimate knowledge of the mountains that few outsiders ever possessed. They communicated with complex systems of whistles and calls that echoed through the canyons, a language designed for the vertiginous landscape. The political relationship forged on this road was as complex as the geography. Chinese emperors used the tea trade as a powerful tool of diplomacy and control, carefully regulating the supply to ensure Tibetan cooperation and a steady flow of those invaluable horses. This created a delicate, interdependent bond, a relationship of mutual need often shrouded in imperial intrigue and suspicion. The road was more than a trade route, it was a tense, strategic frontier where cultural exchange and political maneuvering walked hand in hand along every precarious mile. What other silent agreements between empires have been brokered not in marble halls but on the backs of mules high above the world? While traders navigated the high passes of the tea and horse road, a very different kind of exchange was thriving on the sun-drenched waters of a shared sea. The Mediterranean was not a barrier but a bridge, a liquid crossroads where the Christian, Muslim, and Byzantine worlds met, bartered, and battled. This was the stage for a complex triangular trade, a perpetual dance of commerce and conflict that defined an era. At its heart were the great maritime republics of Italy. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were not cities in the traditional sense. They were corporations masquerading as states, their fortunes built on controlling the flow of goods across this inland sea. Their sleek, agile galleys formed the arteries of this system, carrying Italian linen and woolen textiles eastward to the sophisticated markets of Alexandria and Constantinople. In return, they loaded their holds with Egyptian grain, a vital import for the growing cities of Italy, and with North African gold that had already crossed the Sahara, now seeking new markets in Europe. Spanish wool, prized for its quality, moved east, while spices and silks from further Asia flowed west through these same ports. This created a constant, swirling exchange of necessities and luxuries that fed, clothed, and enriched three different civilizations simultaneously. Yet this commercial harmony existed in the shadow of the sword. The same ships that carried grain and cloth also transported armies and crusaders. The Crusades, those epic religious wars, were paradoxically both a disruption and a fuel for this trade. While they were fought with religious fervor, they also opened new routes and created new demands, placing the Italian merchant republics in the perfect position to profit from both sides. They supplied the Crusader states while simultaneously maintaining lucrative, if clandestine, trade agreements with the very Muslim powers they were supposedly fighting. This blurry line between enemy and business partner was where immense fortunes were made. Piracy was the dark twin of legitimate commerce, a constant risk that was also a lucrative enterprise. Corsairs from both Christian and Muslim ports preyed on shipping, capturing not just goods but people, who were then ransomed or sold into slavery. A merchant vessel was always both a potential treasure chest and a potential target, its fate depending on the shifting winds of politics and the alertness of its lookouts. The true mystery of the Mediterranean trade lies in this deep contradiction. How could such intense religious and political hatred coexist with such deeply intertwined and dependent economies? The answer was a silent, practical understanding that profit often trumped piety. Behind the public rhetoric of holy war, merchants and rulers engaged in a shadowy diplomacy of trade treaties and safe conducts. They created a web of political intrigue so dense that a Venetian doge could be secretly negotiating for preferential tariffs with the Sultan of Egypt, even as his ships carried knights to fight him. This was a world where your worst enemy might also be your most important business partner, and the true loyalty was not to a crown or a cross but to the ledger book. What other hidden alliances, forged not in faith but in mutual greed, have secretly steered the course of history? Centuries before the Italian merchant republics, a different empire mastered the art of moving information with breathtaking speed. The Persian Royal Road was the internet of the ancient world, a 2,500-mile stone-paved superhighway connecting the Aegean Sea to the heart of Iran. Its true genius was not in the road itself, but in the system that ran upon it. A relay of royal mounted couriers could carry a message from one end of the empire to the other in just 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months. They rode day and night in all weather, passing sealed dispatches from one fresh rider to the next at way stations positioned a day's ride apart. These were not simple rest stops, but fortified complexes with fresh horses, supplies, and guards, ensuring that the king's word moved like lightning across the land. The mystery is how this logistical blueprint survived the fall of the Persian Empire itself, its ghost continuing to guide trade and power for 1,000 years into the medieval era. The Islamic caliphates that rose to dominate the region, particularly the Abbasids in their glorious capital of Baghdad, recognized a brilliant system when they saw one. They adopted and expanded this Persian model, creating their own borrowed postal network. This was the medieval equivalent of a high-speed data network carrying more than just official decrees. Along these same secure routes traveled merchants with their caravans of spices and silks, scholars with revolutionary texts on mathematics and medicine, and diplomats carrying treaties that would reshape kingdoms. The road became a conduit for the Islamic Golden Age, allowing knowledge from India, Greece, and Persia to flow into Baghdad's House of Wisdom, where it was translated, debated, and advanced. Think of a lone scholar traveling from Cordoba to Baghdad, his saddlebags stuffed with precious manuscripts. His journey was made possible by that ancient Persian infrastructure, a chain of safe way stations and well-maintained paths that persisted long after the kings who ordered them built were dust. The endurance of this system poses a fascinating question. How does an idea made of stone and logistics outlive empires, religions, and entire ages? It proves that the most powerful legacy is not always a monument or a battle, but a simple, perfect system for connection, one that can be adopted and adapted, silently shaping the world long after its original architects have vanished. Salt was the silent currency that preserved medieval Europe itself. While gold built kingdoms, this white gold kept them from starving. An invisible network of paths, known as the salt roads, crisscrossed the continent, carrying the vital mineral from the coastal salt pans of the Atlantic and Mediterranean deep into the forested heartlands. Without it, meat would rot, dairy would spoil, and the long, lean winters would become a time of desperation. This was not a luxury, but a necessity carved into the very landscape. One of the oldest and most famous of these paths was Italy's Via Salaria, the Salt Road, a highway so essential that it gave its name to the salt it carried. It stretched from the salt marshes at the mouth of the Tiber River, straight through the Apennine Mountains to the Sabine tribes of the interior. For centuries, Roman soldiers were even paid in salt, a practice that gives us our word salary, a direct echo of the value placed on this humble mineral. The control of salt meant the power of life and death over a population, and that power bred immense wealth and constant conflict. Cities that controlled salt springs or key points along the routes grew fat on tolls and taxes. The salt towers that still stand in some European towns were not just for storage, they were fortified symbols of economic dominance, their contents guarded as fiercely as any treasury. A lord who could tax a salt caravan as it crossed his bridge could fund his entire court for a year. This led to endless intrigue and small-scale wars, as local barons and bishops fought for control over a single salt well or a critical mountain pass. The politics of salt were as complex and cutthroat as any royal succession. Imagine a merchant caravan leaving the great salt pans of Brittany, its wagons loaded with hard, white blocks. Its journey inland was a gauntlet of greedy hands, each local authority demanding a cut for safe passage. The merchant's ledger was a map of this extortion, a record of payments made to one petty lord after another, each toll inflating the final price until the salt reached a German village where it was worth more than the meat it was meant to preserve. This constant struggle over a basic commodity reveals a hidden truth, that the flow of salt was as vital to the medieval world as the flow of blood in its veins. What other everyday substances, now taken for granted, once held the power to make or break entire civilizations? Deep within the silent, snow-laden forests of the north, another kind of wealth was being gathered, one that moved on silent paws and wore a coat of darkest jet. The fur trade routes of northern Eurasia were a sprawling, informal web, a shadow economy that stretched from the remote taiga of Siberia to the grand palaces of Constantinople and the rising cities of Europe. For the nobility, fur was more than a luxury, it was a walking emblem of status and power. In drafty stone castles where winter's bite was inescapable, a cloak lined with the pure white of ermine or the impossibly soft, dark silk of sable was a declaration of wealth that everyone could see. The colder the climate, the higher the value, turning the skin of a forest creature into a currency as potent as gold. But how did the pelt of a sable, hunted in the deepest wilderness of a continent, end up draped over the shoulders of a French duchess? The journey began with indigenous trappers, peoples like the Conti and Mansi of western Siberia, whose ancient knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants was unparalleled. They knew how to track the elusive sable, set traps without leaving a human scent, and prepare the pelts with a skill that preserved their lushness. For centuries, they traded these furs westward with Norse and Russian merchants in a quiet, local exchange. Then came the Russian Promyshleniki. These were not soldiers or statesmen, but frontiersmen, a rough and ambitious brotherhood of hunters and adventurers driven east by the insatiable demand for the most valuable furs. Their expansion was a slow, relentless tide, pushing into the unknown reaches of Siberia in search of untouched hunting grounds. They traveled by river in small, sturdy boats, building crude stockades as they went. Their life was one of extreme danger and profound isolation, facing brutal winters, starvation, and sometimes hostile encounters. The further east they pushed, the more the land became a place of legend, rumored to be home to strange monsters and tribes of unimaginable wealth, all guarding the secret sources of the finest furs. This vast, informal network functioned like a chain, with each link adding to the cost and the mystery. A trapper might trade a bundle of sable pelts to a promishlenic for a metal pot, some beads, or a handful of coin. The frontiersman would then transport them to a trading post, where a merchant would consolidate the furs into a valuable shipment for the long journey west. Some furs traveled the river route south to the Black Sea and into the hands of Byzantine merchants. Others went overland through Novgorod and into the Baltic trade, where the Hanseatic League would distribute them across Europe. At every exchange, the story of the fur's origin grew more distant, its journey more mythic. By the time a single, perfect sable pelt reached a London furrier, it was more than an animal skin. It was a relic of a vast, cold, and mysterious world. A world that was being mapped not by kings and cartographers, but by the relentless pursuit of a luxury that grew on the backs of creatures of the deep woods. What other hidden economies, built on the specialized knowledge of indigenous peoples and the raw grit of frontiersmen, have secretly financed the rise of the world's great powers? Where the salt roads sustained the body, another liquid route nourished the soul and fueled the economy. Wine flowed through medieval Europe like a river of liquid currency, its trade routes binding vineyard to monastery and port to pew. This was not merely a beverage, it was a sacred necessity. The Christian Mass required wine for the Eucharist, transforming every celebration into a transaction that connected a local parish to distant, sun-drenched hillsides. This divine demand created a sprawling commercial network, with monasteries acting as its nerve centers. Monks were not just men of prayer, they were Europe's premier vintners, perfecting the craft of viticulture within their cloistered walls. They meticulously documented soil types, pruning techniques, and fermentation processes, their illuminated manuscripts doubling as some of the world's first viticultural guides. Their vineyards in regions like Burgundy and the Rhine Valley became legendary, their output so consistent and high quality that it commanded premium prices across the continent. How did these heavy, fragile casks travel such vast distances? The answer flowed on water. Europe's great rivers were the bottled wine's natural highways. Barrels from the steep slopes of the Rhine Valley were loaded onto flat-bottomed barges to sail north to the bustling markets of the Low Countries and the Baltic. From the vineyards of Bordeaux, ships carried their distinctive claret across the Bay of Biscay to England, where it became the drink of kings and courtiers. The Rhône River funneled wines from its valleys northward, connecting to the Seine and onward to Paris. A single broken cask on a rutted road meant financial ruin, but a barge could carry the vintage of an entire monastery in one secure, smooth journey. The economic power of this trade was immense. A poor harvest in Burgundy could cause financial panic in a London trading house. The reputation of a specific vineyard, much like today, could make its local lord wealthier than a duke with 10,000 acres of grain. This created a delicate and often tense interdependence. A monastery's entire annual income might depend on the safe arrival of its wine fleet in Antwerp, a voyage subject to storms, river pirates, and the shifting politics of toll bridges. The true mystery lies in the silent knowledge locked within the monastery walls. The monks understood terroir centuries before the word was coined, knowing which exact south-facing slope produced a wine that could withstand a long journey without spoiling, or which grape variety yielded a liquid both suitably sacramental and commercially viable. They were guarding recipes for economic stability as much as spiritual grace. Their careful, patient work in the vineyard built fortunes that built cathedrals, proving that the most powerful transformations sometimes begin not with a sword but with a single, perfect grape. The same roads that carried barrels of wine now bore a different kind of pilgrim, their steps directed not by profit but by penance and profound faith. Yet these sacred journeys created a river of humanity so constant that it could not help but become a commercial superhighway in disguise. The great pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem were the spiritual internet of the Middle Ages, connecting every corner of Europe in a web of devotion that pulsed with economic life. A pilgrim setting out for the shrine of St. James in far-off Spain needed food, shelter, and protection. An entire infrastructure blossomed to meet this demand. Monasteries built hospices along the way, offering a simple bed and a hot meal. Kings and wealthy patrons commissioned sturdy stone bridges over treacherous rivers and smooth roads through difficult passes, all in the name of easing the pilgrim's journey. These were not acts of pure charity, they were investments. A well-maintained bridge meant more pilgrims, and more pilgrims meant more business for every tavern, blacksmith, and stablemaster in the region. The same inn that sheltered a weary pilgrim one night could host a silk merchant and his guarded pack train the next. The sacred and the commercial walked the very same path. The most sought-after commodities on these roads were not spices or silks, but objects believed to hold divine power itself, holy relics. A fragment of the true cross, a bone from a martyr, or a thread from the Virgin's cloak could transform a simple church into a major pilgrimage site, drawing thousands of visitors and their offerings. The trade in these items was incredibly lucrative and shrouded in a fog of mystery and outright forgery. How could one verify the authenticity of a saint's finger bone? Unscrupulous merchants and even clerics created a lively black market in counterfeit relics. A pilgrim might pay a small fortune for a vial of dust purported to be from the tomb of St. Peter, only for it to be common roadside dirt. The sheer volume of supposed fragments of the cross scattered across Europe was enough, as the reformer John Calvin later quipped, to build an entire ship. This thriving, often dubious trade reveals a deeper truth: the medieval world's desperate hunger for a tangible connection to the divine, a hunger so powerful it could create an economy of its own. Beneath the surface of pure faith, these routes were engines of cultural and economic exchange. A French stonemason traveling to Compostela might bring new architectural techniques to a Spanish town. A song sung by an Italian pilgrim could become a local favorite in a German village. The scallop shell, the symbol of St. James, became one of the world's first mass-produced souvenirs, crafted and sold by local artisans along the route. The pilgrimage was a grand, unconscious melting pot where ideas, artistic styles, and even culinary recipes were exchanged as freely as coins for a night's lodging. The road to salvation, it turned out, was also the road to a more connected and cosmopolitan world. What other profound cultural shifts have begun not with conquest or commerce, but with the simple, sincere footsteps of countless seekers? The divine thirst for wine and relics rested upon a far more practical foundation, the strength of bronze. Long before gold or silk captivated traders, the true backbone of ancient and medieval power was forged from two humble metals, copper and tin. Their separate journeys across the map converged in the smith's fire to create the alloy that named an entire age. Copper, the more common of the two, flowed from deep mines in the Austrian Alps and the legendary island of Cyprus, a place whose very name gave us the word for the metal. But copper alone was too soft for a strong sword or a durable plowshare. It required a magical ingredient, tin, a scarce and mysterious metal that turned soft copper into hard, resonant bronze. The sources of tin were closely guarded secrets, with the moors of Cornwall in southwestern England and the highlands of Bohemia in Central Europe becoming legendary suppliers. Securing a steady supply of this dull grey metal was a matter of survival for any rising kingdom. Imagine the immense value of a single shipment of Cornish tin ore. After a perilous sea voyage across the stormy Bay of Biscay and through the Strait of Gibraltar, it would be hauled overland to meet Cypriot copper in a Mediterranean workshop. There, in a blaze of heat and skill, the two were combined in a precise ratio, typically 1 part tin to 9 parts copper, to produce the bronze that could be cast into everything from fearsome spearheads that held battle lines to intricate ceremonial cauldrons that sealed political alliances. The control of these metal routes was the ultimate strategic advantage. A chieftain who dominated a tin mine in Cornwall could dictate the military potential of lords 1,000 miles away. The locations of the most productive mines were state secrets, shrouded in as much mystery as the sources of gold or incense. Miners and metalworkers often formed closed, hereditary guilds, passing down their knowledge of vein locations and smelting techniques from father to son in strict secrecy. To reveal the source of the tin was to hand your enemy the very weapons he would use to destroy you. This created a shadowy, high-stakes economy where information was more valuable than the metal itself, and a merchant who knew the path to a hidden tin lode held power rivaling a king. What other invisible recipes, combinations of ordinary substances, have secretly held the power of life and death over entire civilizations? While bronze forged the weapons of war, a quieter, more enduring revolution was traveling along those same dusty paths. It was a technology so transformative that it would outlast every empire, the secret of paper. This knowledge began in the courts of China, where for centuries they had turned mulberry bark and rags into a smooth, durable writing surface. But the formula was a state secret, as protected as any recipe for silk. Its journey west is a story of slow, deliberate transmission, carried not by armies but by merchants and scholars. The crucial transfer happened after a pivotal battle in Central Asia in the 8th century, when Arab forces captured Chinese papermakers and brought their priceless knowledge back to the heart of the Islamic world. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba did not just adopt this technology, they perfected it. They established vast, humming paper mills, replacing fragile papyrus and expensive parchment with a material that was affordable, strong, and could be produced in staggering quantities. This was the spark that ignited an intellectual explosion. In the bustling souks of Baghdad, the book trade became a colossal industry. Paper made books accessible to merchants, scholars, and even curious citizens, not just the royal court. The city's streets were lined with booksellers and stations for professional scribes, their hands a blur as they copied texts for a hungry market. This was more than commerce, it was a mass mobilization of the mind. At the heart of it all was the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was not a simple library but a massive translation and research institute funded by the Caliph himself. Here, scholars of different faiths worked side by side, translating the entire body of classical Greek knowledge, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the medicine of Galen, the geometry of Euclid, from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. They preserved this ancient learning at the very moment it was fading from memory in a war-torn Europe. But how did this preserved knowledge make the final leap across the Mediterranean? The mystery lies in the clandestine networks of translation that operated in the cultural crossroads of places like Toledo, Spain. After Christian kings reconquered the city, they found libraries overflowing with Arabic texts containing the lost wisdom of the Greeks. Eager scholars from across Europe flocked there, learning Arabic and working tirelessly, often in secret, to translate these works into Latin. A single, precious book by the ancient Greek physician Galen might follow a route from a crumbling Byzantine library to a Baghdad translator's desk, to a bookseller in Cordoba, and finally into the hands of a Christian monk in Toledo who would copy it late at night, his work illuminating the path for Europe's own Renaissance. This river of paper and ideas flowed directly into the new universities springing up in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. These institutions ran on books. A student needed a copy of a legal text or a philosophical treatise, and the stationers near the university quarters worked feverishly to meet the demand, employing teams of copyists to produce identical versions. The trade in manuscripts became a sophisticated, if slow, form of mass communication, creating a common intellectual language across the continent. The true impact, however, was even more profound. The very act of preserving and translating these texts forced a conversation across centuries and cultures. An idea from Aristotle, commented on by a Muslim scholar in Baghdad, would be debated by a Jewish thinker in Cordoba and then challenged by a Christian theologian in Paris. Paper provided the physical medium for this grand dialogue, proving that the most powerful cargo carried on the trade routes was not silk or spice, but a blank page waiting to be filled. What other revolutionary ideas are moving through our own networks today, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to change everything? The same roads that carried silk and spices also transported a far more tragic cargo: human beings. The medieval slave trade was a dark and sprawling commerce, a network of misery that operated across continents, from the cold rivers of the north to the blistering sands of the south. Along the Varangian routes, the Vikings were not just traders in furs and amber, they were also prolific slavers. They captured countless people during their raids on Slavic and Baltic settlements, calling them thralls. These captives were then marched south, often chained together in long coffles, to be sold in the great markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. The demand in the wealthy Islamic world for domestic servants, soldiers, and laborers created a brutal economic engine that fueled these northern raids for centuries. Further south, the trans-Saharan routes witnessed a similar human tragedy. Here, slaves were transported north across the desert, a journey so deadly that only the strongest survived. They were forced to walk for weeks, often with little water, to be sold in North African cities. In return, the caravans carried salt and manufactured goods back to the West African empires. This exchange was a core part of the Saharan economy, a grim parallel to the flow of gold. Perhaps the most linguistically enduring of these trades was centered in the Mediterranean. For centuries, Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa dominated a brutal market in Slavic peoples, captured from the lands around the Black Sea. This trade was so extensive that the very word slave entered the English language from the medieval Latin word sclavus, meaning a Slav. The Venetian market on the Rialto was one of the most notorious hubs, where human lives were inspected and auctioned like any other commodity. The moral contradictions were staggering. In a world deeply shaped by religious faith, how could this practice persist? The answer lies in a complex web of economic necessity and twisted justification. Slavery was simply embedded in the economic fabric of the time, providing the manual labor that built cities and worked fields. Furthermore, religious law often forbade the enslavement of fellow believers, but permitted the taking of those outside the faith, creating a perpetual incentive for raids across religious frontiers. This created a heartbreaking cycle where war captives, taken in conflicts between Christendom and Islam or during pagan raids, were funneled into a system that treated people as property. For centuries, this commerce in human lives was a silent, accepted horror underpinning the glittering wealth of the medieval world, a reminder that the most valuable and volatile cargo on these historic routes was humanity itself. A single ship's hull packed with common grain carried more power than a king's decree. As Western Europe's cities swelled with people, their fields could no longer feed them. The solution lay across the Baltic Sea, in the vast, fertile plains of Poland and Prussia. This was the Baltic grain trade, a relentless flow of sustenance that turned the sea into a liquid breadbasket, and the merchants who controlled it into the shadow rulers of the north. The Hanseatic League was the undisputed master of this system. Their cog ships, sturdy and capacious, formed a continuous conveyor belt of grain from the ports of Gdansk and Riga to the hungry docks of Amsterdam, Bruges, and later London. At its peak, this network was so efficient that a shortage in the Low Countries could be alleviated in a matter of weeks, not months, by simply dispatching more ships eastward. The League did not just move the grain, they orchestrated its entire production. Through their contours, they provided loans to local Prussian and Polish nobles to expand their estates, creating a cycle of dependency. The nobles grew more grain to pay their debts, and the Hanseatic merchants exclusively controlled its export, setting the prices that would determine wealth or famine 1,000 miles away. This economic shift began to silently rewire the balance of power across the continent. The wealth generated by feeding millions did not stay in the fertile plains where the grain was grown. It flowed into the stone warehouses and guild halls of Hanseatic cities like Lübeck and Hamburg. This created a fundamental tension, a new kind of power based on control of a necessity rather than control of land. The monarchs of rising states like England and the Netherlands watched this with growing unease. How could a league of merchants with no king and no army hold such sway over their people's dinner tables? The answer was a monopoly they were determined to break. This hunger for direct access to the grain trade fueled naval innovation and territorial ambition, pushing new maritime powers to build their own fleets and challenge the Hanseatic grip on the Baltic. The stage was being set for centuries of future conflict, all fought over the simple, profound power of a loaf of bread. What other quiet, daily necessities hold the hidden leverage to topple empires and birth new ones? While kings hoarded gold and merchants risked everything for spices, another substance held a far deeper power in the East, a stone that was considered the very essence of heaven and earth. This was the Jade Road, a treacherous and secretive path dedicated to a single, mystical commodity. For over 4,000 years, the Chinese revered jade above all other treasures, seeing in its luminous depths the virtues of purity, morality, and immortality. An emperor might be buried in a suit woven from thousands of jade plaques, believing it would preserve his body for eternity, a fate far grander than any coffin of gold. The most sought-after variety was nephrite jade, and its primary source was the remote oasis kingdom of cotton, nestled at the treacherous edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The journey to bring this sacred stone to the heart of Chinese civilization was an epic struggle against one of the most unforgiving landscapes on the planet. The Taklamakan is a sea of shifting sand dunes, a place whose very name translates to the place of no return. Caravans did not cross it so much as navigate around its deadly rim, moving from one tenuous water hole to the next. The blocks of raw jade were immensely heavy and difficult to extract, mined from riverbeds and quarries in the distant Kunlun Mountains. Loading these stones onto the backs of camels for a weeks-long journey through blistering heat and sandstorms was a feat of sheer human determination. Why would anyone endure such hardship for a rock? In Chinese culture, jade was not an ornament, it was a spiritual necessity. It was thought to possess a life force, a kai that resonated with the human spirit. A gentleman was judged by the jade he wore, its unyielding hardness a symbol of his integrity, its smooth warmth a sign of his benevolence. This was a value system where a piece of perfectly carved white nephrite could be deemed more precious than a chest of gold coins, for gold represented wealth, but jade represented the soul. The trade itself was shrouded in layers of sacred mystery. The people of cotton guarded their divine resource fiercely, and legends grew around its origin. One famous tale claimed that the jade was found in the form of giant eggs laid by mystical moon dragons in the rivers that flowed from the mountains. This was not just a pretty story, it was a form of commercial propaganda designed to enhance the value and mystique of their product, convincing Chinese buyers that they were acquiring a piece of the celestial realm. The entire supply chain, from the miner who waded into the freezing rivers to the merchant who presented the finished carving to the imperial court, was bound by oath and secrecy. The true route from cotton, the specific methods of identification, and the master carvers who could see a dragon sleeping within a raw stone block, these were secrets more valuable than the jade itself. What other profound truths about humanity are hidden not in grand histories, but in the silent, enduring appeal of a single, beautiful stone? While empires traded in sacred stones and fragrant resins, England's true medieval wealth walked on four legs and wore a coat of wool. This humble fiber, shorn from millions of sheep grazing on monastic and baronial estates, built a commercial empire so powerful it funded kings and forged international alliances. The entire economic engine of England hummed to the rhythm of the shears. Raw wool was the kingdom's primary export, a white gold so sought after that it flowed in a continuous river from the grassy hills of the Cotswolds and the Yorkshire dales to the expert weavers of Flanders in what is now modern-day Belgium. These Flemish cities, like Bruges and Ghent, were the textile factories of the Middle Ages. Their artisans possessed unparalleled skill, transforming raw, greasy English fleeces into the finest, most luxurious cloth in all of Europe. This finished cloth was then a premium product, shipped back to England for the wealthy or sent onward to markets from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, completing a vast and profitable circuit. The entire system was controlled by a powerful and secretive class of merchants, organized into guilds that dictated quality, set prices, and managed the complex logistics of international shipping. Their ledgers were maps of power, tracking bales of wool as they moved from a rural abbey to a London warehouse, onto a ship crossing the Channel, and into the bustling Flemish cloth halls. But the true master of this trade was the English crown itself. The monarchy quickly realized that taxing wool was the most reliable way to fill the royal coffers. A single customs duty, known as the Great Custom, was levied on every sack of wool exported. This revenue stream became the financial bedrock of the state, funding everything from the construction of castles to the raising of armies for the 100 Years' War against France. The wool tax was so vital that the English exchequer even used a symbolic tally stick, a notched piece of wood split in two, as a physical record of a tax payment. This dependence on wool money created a constant, simmering political intrigue. The king needed Parliament to approve new taxes, and Parliament, largely composed of the very landowners and merchants who grew and sold the wool, used this leverage to bargain for greater rights and political influence. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, where a debate over the wool subsidy could determine whether an army marched or a king was forced into peace. The humble sheep, therefore, was more than a source of clothing. It was a silent political actor, its fleece weaving the very fabric of English power and shaping the delicate balance between a monarch and his people. What other everyday agricultural products have secretly funded the rise of nations and the waging of epic wars? Long before the world knew of Brazilian mines or African riches, the Earth's only diamonds were born in the ancient riverbeds of India. These stones began their lives as rough crystals, unearthed by miners in the legendary Golconda region, a name that would become synonymous with the most perfect, flawless gems ever discovered. Their journey from a dusty Indian quarry to the crown of a European monarch was a slow, secretive pilgrimage across continents, a process that wrapped each stone in layers of myth and immense value. A single diamond might travel overland by ox cart to a Persian port, be shipped across the Arabian Sea to Baghdad, and then be carried by caravan to the Mediterranean coast. At every stop, a new merchant would assess the stone, haggling over its potential and its perils before it moved further along the chain. With each transaction, the price multiplied and the story of the gem grew more elaborate. Its origin became more mysterious, its path more obscured by the dust of the trade routes. The most legendary of these stones, like the great Koh-i-Noor diamond, were not just valuables, they were characters in a high-stakes drama. The Koh-i-Noor, or Mountain of Light, was said to carry a powerful curse, a warning that it would bring misfortune to any man who wore it, while granting supreme power to a woman. This was not mere superstition, it was a narrative woven into the gem's very identity, a story that followed it from the Mughal emperors who first prized it, to the Persian warlords who stole it, and finally to the British colonizers who presented it to Queen Victoria. The curse became part of the gem's pedigree, a dark whisper that only heightened its allure and its perceived power. The true value of these Indian gems was not just in their carats or their clarity, but in the sheer impossibility of their journey. A diamond sparkling on a French king's scepter was a piece of the distant, unknowable East, a tangible piece of a mystery that had crossed deserts, oceans, and the hands of countless strangers, each adding to its legend and its price. What other priceless objects in our museums today carry similar hidden histories of peril and passage, their true stories lost behind their brilliant facades? While kings and merchants charted familiar paths, the true pioneers of the North Atlantic were men chasing giants in a freezing grey sea. Far from the spice routes and the Silk Road, the Basques of northern Spain and southern France were undertaking voyages of staggering endurance, venturing into the fog-shrouded waters off Newfoundland in search of cod and the great right whale. Their wooden ships, powered by sail and oar, probed the edge of the known world, likely reaching the Grand Banks decades, perhaps even a century before Columbus ever set sail west. They were drawn by a natural phenomenon of almost unimaginable scale, the cod fisheries. The waters of the Grand Banks were so thick with fish that sailors claimed you could almost walk on them, and baskets lowered over the side would come up bursting with the cold, slippery bounty. This was not a luxury trade, but a staple that would feed millions in Catholic Europe, where meat was forbidden on holy days but fish was always permitted. The Basques were not just fishermen, however, they were the world's first industrial whalers. Their technology was both simple and brutally effective. When a whale was sighted, small, fast rowboats called chalupas were launched. The harpooner stood in the bow, waiting for the perfect moment to drive his iron-tipped lance into the massive creature. It was a deadly and terrifying dance between man and beast in the open ocean. A successful kill was just the beginning of the grueling work. The whale was towed back to a coastal processing station, often on the very shores of the new land, where its blubber was rendered into oil. This whale oil was liquid gold. In a world before electricity, it was the cleanest burning fuel for lamps, illuminating the homes and streets of Europe. It was also used in soaps, leatherworking, and as a lubricant for early machinery. The whale's baleen, the flexible plates in its mouth used for filter feeding, was another crucial commodity. This strong yet pliable material was the plastic of the Middle Ages, used to make everything from corset stays and buggy whips to fishing rods and umbrella ribs. The entire operation, from the harpoon strike to the barrel of oil, was a masterclass in resource extraction. The true mystery of the Basque whalers is not what they did, but the silence that surrounds their achievements. These voyages were state secrets of the highest order. The location of the rich fishing grounds and whaling stations across the Atlantic was a commercial advantage so immense that the Basques guarded it with their lives. They left no detailed maps for their rivals, no public logs for kings. Their knowledge was passed down orally within tight-knit fishing communities, a collection of waypoints and sea lore memorized by captains and pilots. This secrecy was so effective that when John Cabot rediscovered Newfoundland in 1497, he reported the waters swarming with cod and noted the presence of Basque fishing vessels already there, who had likely been making the trip for generations. This raises a profound question. If the Basques knew of this land, a continent overflowing with wealth, why did they not claim it for a crown or announce their discovery to the world? The answer lies in the nature of their trade. They were not conquerors or empire builders, they were practical businessmen. For them, the New World was not a destination for colonization, but a remote, seasonal workplace. Announcing its location would only invite competition from the Portuguese, the English, and the French, destroying the monopoly that made them wealthy. Their success depended entirely on silence, on being the only ones who knew the path to a shore where fortunes could be hauled from the sea. So while history books credit explorers who planted flags and made proclamations, the Basques were the ghosts of the Atlantic, their epic transatlantic journeys a quiet, open secret among a brotherhood of men who understood that the greatest discoveries are often the ones you keep to yourself. A shimmering bowl of Chinese porcelain, so thin it seemed to glow from within, was a treasure that could bankrupt a European noble. This was the ultimate luxury, a substance as white as jade, harder than metal, and ringing with a pure, clear tone when struck. For centuries, the secret of its creation was locked away in the kilns of Jingdezhen, a mystery as profound as the source of silk or spices. The journey of such a piece was epic. Packed in straw and tea leaves for protection, it would travel the Silk Road by camel or sail the spice routes on a rolling ship, a fragile passenger on a brutal journey. When it finally arrived in Venice or London, it was not merely a dish, it was a miracle of distant science, an object that defied European understanding. How could clay be transformed into something so strong and so beautiful? The answer was a combination of two ingredients: kaolin, a pure white clay, and petunci, a fusible rock fired at temperatures hotter than any European kiln could achieve. This formula was a state secret, and its protection was a matter of national pride for China. But the East held another luminous secret. From the workshops of Damascus and Cairo came a different kind of magic: Islamic lusterware. Artisans had mastered the technique of painting pottery with metallic oxides, then firing it in a smoky, oxygen-deprived kiln. This alchemical process transformed the painted designs into a brilliant, iridescent film of pure metal, shimmering with colors of copper, gold, and ruby. To a medieval European, a lusterware plate did not just hold food, it seemed to hold captured light itself. The desire to possess these secrets ignited a centuries-long campaign of industrial espionage. European potters, particularly in Italy, became obsessed with cracking the code. They acquired broken fragments of imported wares, studying them like forensic scientists, trying to reverse engineer the recipe. They experimented with local clays and glazes, producing imitations that were crude and thick, but which represented the first fumbling steps toward a solution. The most famous breakthrough came from a German alchemist named Johann Friedrich Berger, who was actually imprisoned by his king until he could discover the secret of porcelain. After years of frantic experimentation, he finally succeeded, not with the Chinese recipe, but by using local materials to create a hard, white porcelain that launched the famous Mason factory. This was not just the birth of European porcelain, it was the moment a technological monopoly was broken forever. The relentless pursuit of a beautiful cup and plate, driven by the ancient trade routes, had fundamentally altered the industrial and artistic landscape of the West. What other everyday objects in your home are the direct descendants of such long and secretive journeys? A knight's ultimate weapon was not his sword, but the 1,000 pounds of muscle and trained fury standing between his legs. The medieval warhorse was a living engine of combat, and the specialized trade that supplied these animals was as strategic and secretive as any trade in silk or spices. While local breeds pulled plows and carts, the battlefield demanded a specific kind of beast, the destrier. These were not merely large horses, they were the tanks of their era, bred for strength, agility, and a ferocious temperament that allowed them to charge into a wall of spears. Northern Europe's native stock was too small and light for this brutal work, creating a desperate demand for imports from renowned breeding centers in Spain, Italy, and the Arabian Peninsula. The Spanish stallion, infused with barb blood from North Africa, was prized for its powerful hindquarters and fiery spirit. Italian breeders in regions like Lombardy produced destriers known for their immense size and steady nerve. But the most legendary of all were the Arabian horses, creatures of desert endurance and lightning speed, whose bloodlines were guarded as closely as a royal treasury. The cost of such an animal was staggering. A single, well-trained destrier could be worth the entire annual income of a sizable lord's estate, sometimes trading for a sum equivalent to a dozen heavy plow horses. This was not a purchase, it was an investment in military power and social standing. A knight mounted on a prized Spanish charger was making a visual declaration of his wealth and influence before he ever threw a lance. The trade routes for these living weapons were therefore matters of state security. Kings enacted strict laws forbidding the export of these premium animals to potential enemies, and the sale of a single destrier to a rival kingdom could be considered an act of treason. Breeding centers were often under royal protection or direct control. their locations and methods shrouded in the same secrecy that surrounded a master swordsmith's forge. The mystery of a knight's charger was part of its power. A great warhorse was not just a vehicle, it was a partner in battle, trained to bite, kick, and trample on command. Its value went far beyond its physical attributes. It was a symbol of the knightly ideal itself, a perfect fusion of noble blood, immense wealth, and martial prowess. What other single possessions in history have ever held such concentrated power, embodying the very essence of warfare and status in one living, breathing form? From the warhorses of Europe to the porcelain of China, these 25 historic routes reveal a world in constant, astonishing motion. They were not mere tracks for camels and carts, but the planet's first global nervous system, pulsing with goods, dreams, and revolutions. A sack of peppercorns could launch a voyage to an unknown continent. A block of salt could be traded for its weight in gold, and a single sheet of paper could carry an idea that would outlive every empire. These paths carried the Black Death that reshaped societies, the religions that converted kingdoms, and the technologies that redrew the map of power. They were forged by the courage of nameless merchants guiding their caravans through sandstorms, by Viking crews dragging their longships overland between rivers, and by pilgrims walking 1,000 miles on blistered feet toward a distant shrine. Their collective journeys, driven by faith, greed, and sheer curiosity, wove the separate strands of humanity into the connected world we inhabit today. The ghost of these routes lives on in our language, our food, and the very goods we hold in our hands. So we turn this final question to you. After this journey across continents and centuries, which of these historic trade routes captures your imagination the most? Was it the legendary Silk Road, the perilous Amber Road, or the maritime spice routes? And have you ever walked the streets of an ancient hub like Samarkand, Venice, or Timbuktu, feeling the echo of that timeless commerce beneath your feet? Share your thoughts and your own travels in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation across the digital routes of our own time.